Hello, my name is Stephen Gallagher, and this is a brief introduction to the issues affecting built heritage in Hong Kong and how built heritage in Hong Kong may be protected. So first of all, just a brief introduction to some of the things we're going to have to consider in this introduction. The first, why we're using the term built heritage. There are lots of terms used for buildings and other forms of heritage, particularly antiquities that can be moved. We talk about portable heritage, we talk about movable and immovable heritage as well. But I prefer the term built heritage here for what I'm going to be talking about, because of course, there's very little that can't be moved. So for example, here we have a photograph of Murray House back in the 1980s in Hong Kong. This was a building in central in Hong Kong. We see it in situ here now, but it isn't there anymore. Now it is in Stanley. So it was on the north side of Hong Kong Island, it's now on the south side of Hong Kong Island. And of course, many places around the world, buildings have been moved. So the term movable, immovable, I'd rather use the term built heritage. When I'm using that term in this introduction, I'll be talking about evidence of the activities and achievements of humankind, which affect the natural landscape and subsequent changes to these that should be passed on for the benefit of future generations. It can be very wide. It can be a mining operation, a quarrying operation, landscaping of grounds. All of these things would be included. Of course, we're usually thinking about buildings. We should also remember that we're talking about activities and achievements, but activities, I think, is probably a better word to focus on. These things don't have to be positive. Our heritage, there are many dark, negative aspects of our heritage as well, and we must think about those because these are important to be passed on as well. In Hong Kong, we have some very interesting aspects of our sort of dark heritage. For example, this is a building in Sai Kung in the New Territories of Hong Kong. It is today a kindergarten. It was a building that was built in the late 1930s. Today it looks very military. That's because during the Second World War, with the occupation of Hong Kong by the Japanese, this was used as a center for the Kempitoi, the Japanese military police in their activities in the Sai Kung area, which was an area where there were many people fighting against the Japanese during that time. So it has some very negative connotations. In fact, to the right of it is still a clear area, which was the punishment and execution ground as well. So yeah, some aspects of our built heritage, as with all of our heritage, it can be quite negative, it can be quite dark, it can remind us of bad things. But of course, these are important things to be passed on to the future as well, so that these things don't happen again. Built heritage in Hong Kong. Well, of course, Hong Kong is part of China. And when we think of China, we know there are some incredible aspects of built heritage. For example, the Great Wall, or we can go to the city of Xi'an, see those incredible walls around this city as well. So China's got some incredible built heritage. But of course, people don't usually associate heritage with Hong Kong because everyone thinks of that very modern skyline around the harbour, these incredible skyscraper buildings. And that's not really linked into the idea of old buildings, which is usually what we think of when we think of built heritage. But Hong Kong has got built heritage. Just to sort of focus in on where we are in Hong Kong, I said that Hong Kong, of course, is part of China. Here is a globe showing China and showing that sort of area of Asia where we are situated. Hong Kong then is down towards the bottom of this map of China, and opposite to Macau. We see there, just highlighted there. Hong Kong, of course, became a British colony in 1841. Its importance to the British, well, you can see why it was there. First of all, of course, it's an incredible harbour. We'll come back to the harbour later, but it was an incredible harbour. But it is geographically very important when we think of the trade routes of the early 19th century and right the way through into the 20th century as well. Macau, the Portuguese port, had really controlled the mouth of the Pearl River up to the city of what was then called Canton in Guangzhou, and that was the main trade route with China. Hong Kong, the British took Hong Kong to really take over from the Chinese in controlling trade at that point. So this is where we are today. Focusing on built heritage in Hong Kong, we need to think about Hong Kong as being in three parts, because the British took what became the colony of Hong Kong in three tranches. The first, Hong Kong Island; the second, an area on the Kowloon Peninsula; and the third, the New Territories. And these three tranches of land, which made up the colony of Hong Kong for the British, have slightly different aspects of heritage to do with them. There is an idea, sorry, I'll just sort of highlight that. Hong Kong Island was the first taken in 1841 or 1843, depending on how you want to date things. That was ceded in perpetuity by the Chinese to the British. Then 1860, we get Kowloon Peninsula. 1859, it had originally been leased to the British. 1860, it was ceded again in perpetuity to the British. So the British then have Hong Kong Island and Kowloon Peninsula. In 1899, they lease, or at least there is a convention which purports to be a lease for the New Territories and all of the islands that make up the rest of the area of the New Territories, including Lantau Island, which we can see there, which of course is bigger than Hong Kong Island itself, to the British for 99 years. And of course, that term of 99 years, 1899, 1997, really that's the impetus for the negotiations in the 1980s for the return of Hong Kong to China. But that's the three areas and their sort of their acquisition by the British. There is this idea that was nothing in Hong Kong before the British arrived, and of course that's completely wrong. There's lots of evidence of Neolithic occupation. There are not many buildings that have been preserved which evidence this. That's the general idea. But if we do look around, we will find evidence of Hong Kong's past pre the British. The oldest preserved buildings, it's often said, are in the New Territories, but of course there are some on Hong Kong Island and there are some in Kowloon as well. So on Hong Kong Island, we have the Hung Shing Temple at Chau, which dates from the late 18th century. So definitely pre-British there. In Kowloon, we have the Wong Temple in Kowloon City, and there are other buildings, quite a lot of temples, of course, around the Kowloon area, which predate Kowloon being ceded to the British in 1860. Also, of course, we have Hong Kong's oldest building that's been discovered, which is the Lei Ching Uk Han Temple, so Han Dynasty Temple, which was discovered in Hong Kong in Kowloon in 1955. It's very important in the development of protection for Hong Kong's built heritage. And then in the New Territories, many buildings, many temples and many other buildings, many scholarly linked buildings, walled villages, and of course, our one and only surviving old pagoda, which is on the Pingshan Trail in the New Territories. So again, there are a number of buildings, built heritage sites around Hong Kong Island, Kowloon, and the New Territories, which predate the British arriving. And of course, we've even got post-colonial built heritage now, depending on how you classify built heritage. For example, the Jilin Nunnery in Diamond Hill, although construction of this was started in the 1940s, construction only finished in the late 1990s. So in some ways that could be considered a sort of post-colonial part of the built heritage of Hong Kong. And there are of course many new buildings that have been built in Hong Kong, which are already on their way to being considered part of the built heritage of Hong Kong. So issues with built heritage in Hong Kong, the same as in any vibrant, thriving city, a pressure for development, and the issues to do with the environment, to do with pollution and other issues. And of course, as soon as a building is completed, it needs to be maintained. So the standard issues that affect buildings as well. But perhaps Hong Kong, the pressure on development means that our major problem is this: if we do have old buildings, and even if they're old buildings that you may not immediately see value in, if we get old ancestral halls, as in this one in a village near to where I am in Sai Kung, well, the pressure on development is such that one day when you're walking past, you discover that the building is gone. And that, of course, is a problem with all cities, but I think Hong Kong in particular. For example, our HSBC building, designed by Norman Foster. It's a bit of a Marmite building. You either love it or you hate it. I think it's a great building, so I really like it. It's the 4th building to be on that site since HSBC took over the site in the middle of the 19th century. So 4 buildings on that site in just over 160, 70 years. A lot of pressure on development because of population and lack of developable land. Of course, the other issue is Hong Kong is and has been for some time quite wealthy. And a way of showing that wealth is in replacing buildings and building big new buildings. And that's also, there is an impetus for change as well in the system of landholding that the British developed in Hong Kong when they took over Hong Kong as a colony. They used a leasehold system, and the leasehold system, the idea that you have land for a certain amount of time, in a way encourages the idea of change. There is another issue with Hong Kong. It's often been identified as a temporary place, a place that people come to, make money, and then leave. For the British, of course, the idea of the 99-year lease for the new territories, definitely there was that idea that even if the British did not assume they would have to give the new territories back originally, still there is that idea that the leases that were being granted, being limited originally to 75 years, there is an idea that change will happen, and that does not make people really appreciate the idea of heritage in a city where people are thinking that they will only be there for a short amount of time. The development of protection for built heritage in Hong Kong, well, that came about in the sort of normal ways that heritage has been preserved in cities around the world. Carol Rose famously wrote a very important article where she described the sort of drivers for protection, and that's been very similar in Hong Kong as well. The idea of power, of wealth being the initial driver, the buildings that show that power and wealth. So we get government buildings, military buildings, religious buildings. That's been something that we've seen in Hong Kong as well. Many of our existing buildings today, the built heritage, well, it will be temples, it'll be buildings linked into the military or into the government as well. But apart from that, we're going to focus on the development of protection for built heritage in Hong Kong in these sort of slices. The first is the development of protection for built heritage in Hong Kong up to 1976. The second is the bringing into effect of the Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance, which is the main statutory provision which protects built heritage in Hong Kong, or is meant to protect it, and then problems with the Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance before 1997, before the handing back of Hong Kong to China, and then what happened between 1997 and 2006, that first sort of 10-year period of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Then we'll look at what happened in 2006 and 7, because it's very important in the development of protection for cultural heritage in Hong Kong. Social unrest, protest, the government's reactions, the administration's reactions, the concessions that the government made at that point. And then what's happened since 2007, successes and failures, and maybe draw some conclusions on this depending on the time. So up to 1976, first public protection of heritage in Hong Kong, as I said, usually followed the idea of Carol Rose, the idea of buildings of power initially. Possibly the most important and probably the one that gives us the best signal that this building was meant to be preserved is St. John's Cathedral, which was opened in 1849. Its importance in Hong Kong, it is the only grant of land in Hong Kong which is not leasehold, which is a freehold, an in perpetuity grant. So the land was meant to be dedicated to the church forever. And that gives us an idea that the buildings on it, the whole idea of the cathedral, was meant to be protected. Apart from that, the main protector of heritage in Hong Kong has been when it's been forgotten, when it's been out of sight, perhaps inaccessible up in the new territories, or even as in this particular building here down in Kowloon, it is just forgotten. So this shows an aerial view of a demolition that was occurring of a reservoir in an area that's now referred to as Bishop's Hill in Kowloon. When this was being demolished, suddenly some locals got in and took photographs because they realized that actually this was an incredible building. Built in the early 20th century, the very early 20th century, it had just sort of gone under the radar of all of the heritage organizations in Hong Kong and been forgotten, which probably had led to it being preserved until it was scheduled for demolition by the Water Authority. And then when it was discovered, well, perhaps because today we live in times when people in Hong Kong do value their heritage, of course there was a public outcry, and we'll deal with what happened with the public outcry at the end. The first law in Hong Kong to actually protect what could be referred to as built heritage is the law to protect this rock or boulder, and that's the Wong Toi Reservation Ordinance, which was gazetted in 1899. This rock is a rock to commemorate the visit of the two boy emperors of China to Hong Kong, part of a long story about the what actually happened to these boys, and part of the very important history of Hong Kong. Inscribed, the visit is commemorated an inscription on the side of this rock, and this boulder in Kowloon, very near to Kowloon City, when the British leased Kowloon in 1860, part of the agreement, or in the negotiations, the Chinese delegation said, please look after this boulder. It's very important in Chinese history. And in 1899, as I said, the Hong Kong Legislative Council gazetted this ordinance to protect this particular boulder and the area around it, because they said it was important to the Chinese in Hong Kong and the Chinese generally. Unfortunately, the boulder suffered during the Second World War under the Japanese, and I'll mention that very shortly coming up. And this is all that's left of it today. It's no longer protected by its own statute because, well, after the Second World War, there wasn't really that much of it. It was cut down, part of the inscription was saved, and it's now on display in a small area in Hong Kong now. The Second World War in Hong Kong, a time of devastation around the world, and Hong Kong suffered under the Japanese occupation, and of course the bombardment of Americans and British and other actions that went on against the Japanese while they were in Hong Kong as well. So 8th of December 1941, the Japanese invade into Hong Kong. Christmas Day, the British surrender. 3 years and it's about 9 months of occupation, lots of destruction. Of course, no one able to preserve at the time, focused just on survival. Lots of things lost during the Second World War, and some of our built heritage, of course, lost at that time. Post-war, the focus, of course, was on rebuilding, and again, a lot of heritage was destroyed because of the rebuilding that went on. We know that happened again around the world. Often it's cheaper to clear and build than it is to, of course, renovate and conserve in any way. But 1955, a very important discovery in Hong Kong, which begins the road to legislative protection of Hong Kong's built heritage. This is discovery of the Lei Ching Uk hand tomb, the one I mentioned earlier, coming up for possibly 2,000 years old, discovered accidentally during the building of one of Hong Kong's first public housing estates. Again, a very important part in Hong Kong's built heritage, the housing estates themselves. When it is discovered, it's a bit of a shock to everyone, because there was the general idea that again, as I said, that there wasn't that much in Hong Kong. So the discovery of this tomb meant that many people in Hong Kong started to say, well, we need to protect this. We need to protect the tomb. And also we need to be aware that there may be other things that we may discover, and we need to be ready to protect them as well. So this leads to the Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance. The ordinance doesn't come about immediately. 1960s, we get pressure groups, heritage, archaeological, mostly archaeological groups, who are pressuring the government drafting provisions that they say should be put forward into some legislation right the way through the 1960s. 1971, we get the gazetting of the ordinance itself, but it doesn't come into effect until 1976. Very sort of briefly to do with this, when it comes into effect in 1976, we also get the creation of the Antiquities and Monuments section in the Urban Services Department. That becomes the Antiquities and Monuments Office. And we get to help with the government with decisions to do with antiquities in Hong Kong, the Antiquities Advisory Board as well. But we'll come back to those a little bit later on. The Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance, most important thing to remember, the main purpose was not to protect built heritage. It was really focused on the archaeological. The people who've been pressuring for this were archaeologists and others interested in archaeology. So that was the focus in the 1960s coming into the 1970s. That's why it emphasizes the preservation of historical, archaeological and paleontological interest, and for matters ancillary there too, or connected therewith. It does use the word historical, but the focus was really on archaeological to begin with. It does offer two forms of protection, which could be applied to built heritage as well as to archaeological finds. The first is an automatic form of protection. There is a duty to report antiquities and relics, and any relics that are discovered in Hong Kong after the coming into effect of the ordinance in 1976 are deemed to belong to the Hong Kong SAR. So that is a form of protection, and there's lots of provisions in there that say what can and can't be done. If you fail to report, it is an offence under the ordinance as well. There's also a form of protection in that the authority, and today the authority in Hong Kong is the Secretary for Development, may declare a monument. And in 1982, it was brought in that he could also declare what's called a proposed monument. So we get an automatic form of protection and a declaratory form of protection as well. The automatic form of protection applies to antiquities and relics. For built heritage, we'll usually be using the term an antiquity. An antiquity is defined as a relic, and that's something that was created or affected by man pre-1800. The antiquity is therefore a relic and a place, building, site or structure erected, formed or built by human agency before the year 1800, and the ruins or remains of any such place, building, site or structure, whether or not the same has been modified, added to or restored after the year 1799. Now from this we can see, first I should say, there is no reason for the year 1800 being given. There's no historical reason linked into the geographic area of Hong Kong, even in the law to do with if we think of the British administration at the time, British colonial administration, there's no real reason for picking the year 1800. It seems to be purely arbitrary. The important thing is, of course, it predates the British colony. So it means that anything constructed during the time of the British colony is not automatically protected. And it seems that there was an assumption that there wouldn't be much affected. And that's probably why this date was actually included. The statute itself, I won't go through all the provisions, but of course it has definitions to do with what a proposed monument and a monument is. We will come to those a little bit later on. And it outlines the powers of the authority, says what the authority can do in declaring a proposed monument and a monument, and also what powers the authority has once they've actually declared that, and then what restrictions there are to do with the use of a proposed monument or a monument. There is provision for compensation if a private owner of land finds that part of his land or a building on his land is declared as a proposed monument, that would be usually the initial stage, or a monument, well then compensation may be payable because it affects what they can actually do with the building, with the land. And there are appeal mechanisms and exemption mechanisms as well. The penalties for non-compliance, they're not very this comes from the 1970s and it hasn't really been updated that much. Fines between 5,000 Hong Kong and 100,000 Hong Kong, and terms of imprisonment of 6 months to a year. And if anyone has ever heard of anyone actually being imprisoned because of this ordinance, well, I'd be very grateful if they would let me know about that. The definitions to do with monuments. A declared monument is any place, building, site or structure which the authority considers to be of public interest by reason of its historical, archaeological or paleontological significance. As it says there, a place, building, site or structure which is declared to be a monument. The addition in 1982 of the concept of the proposed monument is a safeguard valve. This is the idea that the Secretary of Development, who is now the authority, may, if he is concerned about a building or a site, declare it a proposed monument for up to a 12-month period, so that the decision can be made about whether it should become a monument as well. In doing this, the Secretary for Development does not need the approval of our Chief Executive, but they must consult the Antiquities Advisory Board. But they don't have to follow the advice, they just have to consult them. And we know this because of some unfortunate cases that we've had in Hong Kong as well. The authority may, at the end of the 12-month period, allow the declaration to lapse. He may withdraw it before the end of the 12 months, or he may declare the proposed monument a monument. And as I said before, those who do not agree with the designation of a proposed monument or even a monument may object. They object to the authority, to the Secretary of Development and to the Chief Executive, but the Chief Executive's direction is final and not open to review by the courts. As long as the procedures are followed, consultation by the authority, reference up to the CE when it is necessary, then the decision cannot be challenged. The Chief Executive's decision cannot be challenged. And that goes as well if the authority decides not to designate something a proposed monument or a monument. As I said before, the designation of a proposed monument is an emergency measure to protect the site while it's been considered what should happen to the site. And the government has a number of options. It may, because of course in Hong Kong, as in, again, most places around the world, land is so important, it may buy the land. It may offer the owner a land swap or some form of financial support if they do not, or if they do conserve the built heritage. It's a very sort of well, the use of this particular power is very controversial in Hong Kong, and it's only been used 5 times since it was introduced in 1982. The Antiquities and Monuments Office is part of the Leisure and Cultural Services Department, and it's responsible for the day-to-day protection and preservation of Hong Kong's built heritage. It's involved in the assessing of historic buildings and our new scheme to do with adaptive reuse of buildings. It's the vetting organization for that as well. It also works as the secretariat of the Antiquities Advisory Board. The Antiquities Advisory Board, as I said before, that was formed in 1976. It first met in January 1977. The members are unpaid and they're appointed by our Chief Executive. And they are to aid in the identification of heritage which will need protection in the future, really. So their duties are to do with advising the Antiquities and Monuments Office and ultimately the authority today, the Secretary for Development, on decisions to do with declaring monuments and proposed monuments. They have no powers. There is a system of grading. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. Grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 1 being a site which is most in need of protection and should be declared a monument, but it has no legal effect, purely administrative. So before 1976, lots of buildings were lost in Hong Kong. Even in that period between the gazetting of the Ordinance 1971 and 1976, a lot of buildings were lost, and there were groups who raised concerns about them. Here we have a photograph of the General Post Office, built in 1911, demolished in 1976, the year that the ordinance came into effect. This building was actually demolished. I should say, though, that not everyone agreed that this was a great building anyway. Those of you familiar with John le Carré's book, The Honourable Schoolboy, will know that he didn't describe it in very favourable terms. 1976 to 1997, the colonial regime with the ordinance in place. This was not a time when buildings were wholesale preserved. As I said before, remember the ordinance was not intended to protect buildings. It was really originally there for archaeological concerns. The groups that then tried to use it and encourage the protection of buildings, well, they were often frustrated. So there are many examples, but let me focus on this. The Kowloon Canton Railway terminal down in Sim Sha Sui, and opposite to it, the Marine Police headquarters, they were scheduled for demolition in 1974. And lots of groups, this became a really important issue in Hong Kong, with many hundreds and thousands of people campaigning to stop the demolition of these buildings, to at least preserve the facade. And the Antiquities Advisory Board actually recommended the preservation of the facade of the building and the clock tower there as well. The Queen was even lobbied by the appealed to by the groups as well. She did the usual thing that happens in those circumstances with a colony. She referred it on to the then governor, and of course the building was demolished. All that stands today, the concession, the clock tower. The Marine Police headquarters was not demolished. We'll come back to that later. But the railway station itself, the facade, was demolished. So lots of buildings were demolished under the colonial administration. What happened when Hong Kong was returned to China? Those first 10 years, 1997 to 2006. Well, it started well. We had positive statements from the chief executive. We had the gazetting of a number of monuments, including many of them were older buildings in the New Territories, or buildings linked to figures associated with the revolution, Sun Yat-sen and others. But there were also some colonial buildings that were gazetted as monuments as well. So it looked like the new administration was sort of had the idea of protecting heritage in Hong Kong, particularly, as I said, that our first chief executive made some very positive statements in 1999 about the value of heritage generally to Hong Kong. The Antiquities and Monuments Office, it finished a territory-wide survey of built heritage in Hong Kong, of terrestrial heritage in Hong Kong. In doing so, working with the Antiquities Advisory Board, they developed their own administrative guidelines for the protection of historic buildings, that grading system, the grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. So we started to see lists of buildings with grades, recognition that they were important as well. So the value of heritage was being publicly discussed. Also, there have been a number of issues to do with Victoria Harbour. That had started under the colonial administration. Many people in Hong Kong were very worried about the reclamation of land and the development that went on around the harbour, seeing the Victoria Harbour as being the heart of Hong Kong, and often what everyone associates as being Hong Kong is the harbour itself. So it had the passing of the Protection of the Harbour Ordinance in 1997 itself. We'd had a number of groups who'd been very vocal in their demonstrations to protect the harbour. We'd seen some plans being delayed, but still there was some development going on. So groups were not completely happy, but there was a dialogue ongoing. There was a lot of public expression of hope for protection in the future. And then 2001, we actually got the development of the Urban Renewal Authority with its own ordinance. And one of its purposes was stated to be to preserve building sites and structures of historical, cultural, or architectural interest. Only one of its purposes, I should say. Its main purpose is, of course, to provide decent living quarters for people. But it was seen that this was an important highlight again of the fact that the Urban Renewal Authority should consider heritage when it was making any decisions. The URA has been criticised many times. We'll come back to that later. And then we had Kom Tong Hall as well. This was a building, built by a Chinese in the late 1920s, early 1930s in Hong Kong. Very impressive building, very important in Hong Kong's sort of architectural history. And the private owners at the time were going to sell it. It was going to be developed. There was a public outcry. The government reacted very quickly. They negotiated with the church that owned it, purchased it for 53 million Hong Kong dollars, a considerable sum at the time, probably now a bargain, but a considerable sum then. And, they saved the building. Then there's a problem. What do we do with it? Eventually, they turn it into a museum for Dr. Sun Yat-sen, although he's got no real association with the building. But the building was protected. The building is there today. It is a museum to Dr. Sun Yat-sen now, and declared a monument eventually in 2010. The Morrison Building, again, a building in private ownership. The second use ever of the proposed monument statement. The then authority declares that the Morrison Building is a proposed monument to stop it being developed. And then afterwards declares it as a monument, even in the face of opposition from the private owner of this building. This is very important in any place which values sorry, property rights, particularly in Hong Kong, where property rights are considered so important. So we see the post-colonial government actually doing things very positive in the protection of built heritage. And then everything goes wrong. 2006, 2007, the government seriously misjudges the public feeling towards heritage. Possibly we can understand this. They may have thought that the particular issues that arose, in particular the issues to do with the Star Ferry Pier and the Queen's Pier, it's difficult for many people to understand why these become so important. So the issues are to do with this. The Star Ferry Pier, one of the piers in Central, and the Queen's Pier next to it, which were piers that had been used for a long time in Hong Kong, but the actual piers themselves, the construction of them, usually the 1950s, they weren't particularly old. Because of the land reclamation project in Central to move the land out to gain back more land in Central, these two piers were to be demolished. On the 11th of November 2006, the last ferry ride took place from the Star Ferry Pier in Central, and thousands of people turned out, and people were demonstrating, and people occupied the pier. The pier had to be cleared. The government demolishes the pier, and the plans are still there to demolish the Queen's Pier in 2007, the following year. And people start to demonstrate again, and things get quite ugly. There were other issues going on at the same time. The Urban Renewal Authority had been tasked with renovating Tung Street, or Wedding Card Street, and they spend billions of dollars, and there's a lot of mockery about the whole project of what they actually did, whether it was a heritage project in any way. There is also an issue to do with a building, Yin Lei, which the government is seen to fail to protect, at least initially. So the Queen's Pier, again, quite an ugly, a brutalist concrete architectural structure. The government, I think in many ways, could be forgiven to think, well, who'll care? We'll just knock it down. We'll move the ferry piers out a little bit more because we're reclaiming this land. It's very important for Hong Kong. But Hong Kongers didn't like it. They didn't like the Star Ferry being demolished, and Queen's Pier became a focal point for demonstrations. Named after Queen Victoria, we might see that the post-colonial government in Hong Kong might also not really want a Queen's Pier, and that was one of the issues that the people of Hong Kong also noted. This could be a break with their link to their colonial past as well, their heritage. It had been the arrival point of all of Hong Kong governors since 1925, even though the structure itself was built afterwards. Queen Elizabeth II had actually arrived there in 1975, and the Prince and Princess of Wales in 1989. So it had an important heritage value to the people of Hong Kong, and they demonstrated, and the demonstrations got violent. And the Hong Kong government was not expecting this. It was a shock to them. They reacted by, of course, clearing the pier and demolishing the pier. But I think it actually concerned them so much that it affected a change in policy towards not just built heritage, but heritage generally in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong government suddenly realized that heritage mattered to the people of Hong Kong, and they needed to be careful. The Queen's Pier legal action was taken to judicially review the decision, but the courts had to say that the decision could not be reviewed. The procedure had been followed correctly. Therefore, there was no need for the courts to interfere. Those seeking the judicial review said that the Antiquities Authority should have declared the Queen's Pier a monument and thus protected it. The Antiquities Advisory Board had recommended that it should be protected. There had been a heritage impact assessment. There had been a review done which actually said that this pier had, even if the structure itself was not significant, but there were other issues to do with it that made it significant as well. But the government carried on with its plan. It dismantled the pier. It was removed by the end of March in 2008. This is a picture of the old Wedding Card Street. I said the Urban Renewal Authority was tasked with its a sort of a new development of this area as well, remembering that one of its tasks is also to consider historical issues and heritage when it's making these developments as well. And this is what they came up with, and this attracted a lot of mockery. The word Disney, the name Disney was used a lot as well. It's a shopping precinct. So we've gone from an area that was linked to a particular trade and had an important, what we today call intangible cultural heritage value, is turned into a shopping precinct. And this is King Yin Lei. And King Yin Lei, the private owner of this, said that he actually offered the building to the government. He said, look, do you want to buy this from me? Do you want to swap me some land for it? I think it's a nice building. I bought it to develop it. If you don't want it, I'll knock it down. And the government ignored him. So he started to demolish it, but he didn't send in the wrecking balls and just knock it down. He sent workers up to start using hammers and other things to take away the tiles on the roof very visibly. And local people got very upset, and there became a newspaper campaign, and the government then contacted him and negotiated with him. And they offered him a land swap. They offered him land in exchange, and he took the land swap as well. So probably he didn't want to demolish it. He just wanted to, get some better land to actually build on or whatever else. But again, the government was criticized. They had not acted. They did act only when public opinion, when public outcry was such. And again, I think this links into that whole period where the government suddenly became aware that people valued their heritage, and the government in Hong Kong reacted and did try to do something to appease people when it came to these heritage issues. One of the few areas where the government of Hong Kong will actually react in a positive manner to demonstrations and public outcry. So what were the concessions that the administration made at that point? The chief executive, in his letter that he gives every January to the people of Hong Kong, noted how important it was obvious that the heritage of Hong Kong was to these people. But he did say at the end, to keep pace with, we will keep pace with public sentiment on heritage issues, but we cannot afford heritage preservation if we do not preserve our economic sustainability. This was at the beginning of 2007. Of course, Queen's Pier gets removed in that year. There are further issues, but he is expressing, at least we understand that you are concerned about this. By the end of the year, in the policy address, these things are being included. Mandatory heritage impact assessments for all new capital works in Hong Kong. A major concession. The creation of a Commissioner for Heritage Office to support the Secretary for Development, the Antiquities Authority, in implementing heritage conservation policy and the initiatives announced in the policy address. A new office to actually promote the protection of heritage as well. And also an implementation of what's called the Revitalisation Historic Buildings through Partnership Scheme for government-owned historic buildings, an adaptive reuse scheme that will be introduced so that groups could work with the government. The government could fund projects to actually save buildings and find new uses for them, because adaptive reuse is the best way of protecting these old buildings. There were other concessions as well. Queen's Pier did get demolished, but the government promised to take it down, and they have, and put it in storage, and to re-erect it when the reclamation project is over. Now that hasn't happened yet. Every so often it's raised in the newspapers, and the government has put forward a plan of where they will rebuild the Queen's Pier. Some people are not happy because they think it's further away from the sort of central side it was on, but it is a concession by the government. Even though they demolished it, they did concede to actually rebuild it as well. And also at that time, we get the implementation coming into 2008 of our intangible cultural heritage policy, a celebration of intangible cultural heritage. Now that was happening all across the world, and specifically in China, but also I don't think it's any coincidence that a lot of emphasis was placed on this there. It was to say that the government did care about heritage. And again, celebrating intangible cultural heritage doesn't cost much money. It doesn't mean you can't really knock down buildings too much. It's again a good way to perhaps draw people on your side. This, I think, was all part of the concessionary attitude of the governments at the time. What happened after 2007 then? The government, I think, did take note of the fact that people cared about heritage, but we still did have some problems. Famously, the Hotung Gardens site, this was in private ownership. In 2011, it came to public attention that the owner was going to demolish this. It's a building linked to Sir Robert Hotung, a very important character in Hong Kong's history. His granddaughter was going to demolish this to build new houses. And there was a bit of a public outcry. The government implemented again the proposed monument status to protect the building for up to 12 months. They negotiated with the owner. She asked them far too much money, much more than the market price to be paid for this. And the government in the end made the decision that they could not use public money for this when there were other things to use public money. And there was criticism at the time. I think there was also a lot of people who thought probably the government made the right decision. It would have cost 7 billion Hong Kong dollars. That's what the owner was asking for. And the government probably had better uses of 7 billion Hong Kong dollars. So unfortunately, we lost Hotung Gardens, but again, the government did act. They did make it a proposed monument. It's much more than they had done, well, they'd usually done in the past. We had the issue with the old walled village, which was outside of the Yuen, the customs house in Kowloon City. Here we see an old sort of 1960s photograph of it. It was the last walled village in the urban environment of Hong Kong in Kowloon. There are some up in the New Territory still. So there was an argument that it should be preserved, but this is what it looked like at the time. There wasn't that much left. There were arguments from archaeologists that there were still things underneath that should be preserved, but the Urban Renewal Authority were involved and had committed to building new blocks of flats with a private developer. Again, there was criticism of this, but there were also those who again said, well, what actually would you preserve out of this? There are the old temple that's in there, I think, is going to be preserved as part of the new development. The old Marine Police headquarters that I said had originally been scheduled for demolition back in 1974, along with the KCR, the Kowloon Canton Railway Station. The station was knocked down. The clock tower was preserved. And also the old Marine Police headquarters was not demolished. It was developed, but when it was finally open to the public, there was a lot of criticism of this because there were new additions. Certain things that were meant to have been preserved weren't. Again, there was a lot of criticism because it became just a shopping centre. And again, people identified this as sort of Disney heritage. Again, there is always that question of what can you do with these buildings? This is in a prime, probably one of the most important retail spaces in the world. And just preserving it as it was, well, that wasn't really an option. We could have turned it into another museum, but the argument is there are enough museums in that area. Well, that's part of the question. Positives since 2007. The Greenhouse Project, another project involving the Urban Renewal Authority and other groups as well, has won awards. So we get this group of what are Tung Lao, the old shop houses in Wan Chai. We get them an addition of a building on the back for accommodation. The buildings incorporate a storytelling of the history of the area and everything else to do with the culture. So we get very much a positive there. The Red House, a house up in the New Territories near to Yuen Long, which is said to be linked to Dr. Sun Yat-sen and some of the early revolutionaries. This came to the public's attention in 2016, 2017, when it was seen that the private owner might be getting rid of the tenants and pulling out windows and starting to get ready to demolish it. And again, bit of a public outcry, the government react. They, again, use the proposed monument status to protect it, and then negotiate with the owner, give him loans in return, loans to conserve the building in return for the promise that he won't develop it at least for 10 years. So there is time to consider what is to be done with this building. And then Tai Kwun, the old central police station, the magistracy. So we have the old central police station, the magistrates court, and the old part of Victoria prison there as well. A big compound, which in a collaboration with the Hong Kong Jockey Club, there was a conservation project, a massive conservation project that went on. Lots of consultation with local people. Concerns about what would happen with the building, concerns that if it did become some sort of tourist hotspot, then it would bring too many people into already a very busy neighborhood. But in the end, I think most people are very happy with what's gone on there. A very good conservation project, which has become a space which is being used by people for arts purposes and just generally for getting together, as long with the museums linked into the police station, the magistrates court, the prison, a museum art gallery, and other things on the site as well. So a very successful project, it seems. Just in August, September of 2021, we get the opening of the old Central Market. This had been, again, a project linked into the Urban Renewal Authority, and lots of criticism that there wasn't enough consultation going on. Before it was opened up, there was criticism that the authorities hadn't really disclosed enough of what they were going to do. Since its opening, I think many people have been very pleasantly surprised by this. We've now got conservation of the exterior of this Bauhaus style building. Interior, there'd been a commitment to preserve many elements of the interior, including the staircases, including some of the old stalls that were used for the selling of meat, fish, vegetables, or whatever in the market. And it's now being used again as a restaurant and other retail form of space. But again, I think many people are very positive about this particular conservation. Private individuals, private companies in Hong Kong, it seems have, well, they've probably been faster at learning than even the government. The government definitely have recognized the value of heritage, in particular built heritage, to the people of Hong Kong. But these private companies, it seems, are really understanding this now as well. So this is the old State Theatre in North Point. Very unusual building, quite a striking building, that incredible sort of cantilevered roof. It's the only existing form of that, I think, in Southeast Asia, in Asia. And the frontage with the sort of the stucco design of dragons and other things, very impressive. Inside, the old theatre had been subject to a fire at one point, had been used as a billiards, a snooker hall at one point, subdivided into little units and everything else. When the private company announced that it was trying to buy out all of the little units and it was then going to develop, again, there were concerns of what would happen with this. Would it just be knocked down? Again, it's a prime site for development. And the company have committed, in association with the government, to conserving the theatre itself in ways that the public can enjoy. And as part of that, they opened in 2021 during the summer, they opened the theatre for guided tours to show people what it looked like today, to show the old shop units in the base, take them up onto the roof and show them around. And again, saying, you know, we appreciate that this is a very important building in Hong Kong, not because of just its architectural design, but of course because of its links to an area of Hong Kong, which at one point was called Little Shanghai. It was linked into particular groups that had come from a particular area in Hong Kong, a particular culture as well. All of those things that want to be remembered and celebrated. So a very positive thing, I think, for Hong Kong. Back to the government and the way things are happening in Hong Kong today. I said to you that in the end of 2020, December 2020, the Water Authority was demolishing this reservoir in what's now referred to as Bishop's Hill in Kowloon. And of course, some locals, explorers get in and see this and take photographs, get inside, and we see these incredible sort of Edwardian arches, almost Byzantine in their form, an incredible structure. And there is a public outcry. Immediately, the government reacts. Immediately, the government says, we stop everything now. The Water Authority stops immediately. The government says, we will commit to protect and preserve this site and use it in some way. And that's, I think, we take that back to 2006, 2007. The public protests, the recognition the government have had that actually people in Hong Kong really care about their heritage. And this is an area where perhaps the government can actually take note of that concern and do something to actually please the people of Hong Kong. So other things came out of this, some very honest declarations that other buildings had been knocked down before. Usually these sorts of things don't come out. In most governments around the world, there are There are often convenient moments of amnesia about these sorts of things. Well, it was disclosed shortly afterwards by the Water Authority. Actually, we checked in our records and we think we actually got rid of another old structure a few years ago or whatever else. Now we will work with the Antiquities Advisory Board. We will check on our structures as well. But the government, those involved in this, even our private companies in Hong Kong, I think there are very many positives for built heritage in Hong Kong for the future. If anyone's got any questions or any comments, my email is usually somewhere on the YouTube site, and yeah, I'd always very happy to hear from anyone, particularly if you disagree with me. That's always one of the best forms of feedback. Thank you very much.